This is U.S. History Regents Review, Unit 3, video number 6. We're talking about industrialization. The people who are leading a lot of this industrialization sometimes get the nicknames captains of industry, or sometimes they get called robber barons, and it depends on your perspective of these men. These are men who formed trusts to eliminate competition, conquered all of their competition, and became incredibly wealthy. And here's a picture of 4 of the most famous of them: Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, and JP Morgan. And how did they do this? Vanderbilt, he dominated railroads, shipping, steamships. JP Morgan became a great banker. He eventually put together US Steel. He bought it from Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie, he was a Scottish immigrant. He's the only one who truly lived out the rags to riches story. He was not wealthy. And he did this by perfecting the creation of steel through a new method called the Bessemer process, which basically had fewer impurities and made stronger and better steel. He's also known for writing what's called the Gospel of Wealth. This was an essay where he argued that industrialists are responsible for caring for society through philanthropy. Philanthropy is the giving away of riches to help others. So when wealthy people give away a lot of money, like Carnegie built libraries, or people build hospitals, other things like that, they're called philanthropists. And all 4 men of, did this to some extent, but some were way more generous than others. Vanderbilt and Morgan are not really known for being that generous. Carnegie, he was probably the most. Rockefeller also gave away a lot of his money. John D. Rockefeller, he created his company Standard Oil, which dominated the oil refining industry. So he essentially owned all oil refining in the country. He had no competitors, and he created a Standard Oil for people to purchase. But again, these people were controversial because while they created good products and they would lower prices to outdo their competition, they would raise them once their competition was gone. And they would use railroad rebates and other kind of sneaky things to earn money. But then they'd give away a lot of money. But they didn't pay their workers very well. So these are just controversial people. You can admire them for their business genius, or you can criticize them for hurting other people, including their workers. You often will see on your tests a political cartoon that often shows these trusts looking like monsters, looking like an octopus. So here we have Standard Oil taking over everything, including the government. These men had a lot of power over government, and people thought this was really corrupt. JP Morgan actually had to bail out the federal government at one point during a recession. Another man who will become very wealthy a bit later, become one of these men, is Henry Ford. And this is another example of how industrialization was changing production. Cars used to be made from start to finish. One group of people would just build the whole car. Now Henry Ford created and used assembly lines where all of the workers do one simple task, usually an unskilled task, and they do it over and over again. They use interchangeable parts, so they can all just build a bunch of cars at the same time. So Henry Ford becomes wealthy through selling his Model T. So everybody had the same car, but they could actually afford it in the 1920s. But as these people are getting really rich, there is a labor movement. The workers want to share in this wealth and prosperity that the country is experiencing. So we're talking about people working in factories, working on railroads, and working in mines. What were the challenges they faced? They had low pay, really long hours, and maybe no days off. They had dangerous working conditions, poor safety standards. Some factories had very little ventilation, little light. They would get sick. There were no protections for injuries on the job. Sometimes factories would not spend the basic amount to have basic safety features because they didn't want to waste the money, wasn't seen as worth it. Child labor was very common. This is kind of a famous picture of boys working in the mines, like little kids. And non-skilled workers could be easily replaced. So there's no job security for a lot of these people, especially in cities like New York City. Sweatshops were common, like really crowded. Garment industry, for example, was known for having sweatshops, just horrible conditions. And eventually the workers, they try to fight for their rights and they unite under labor unions. And the strategies they would use included collective bargaining. This is where you have a labor union leader who represents all of you and will try to sit down and negotiate for better conditions with the person who owns the business or the factory. Or if that doesn't work, going on strikes, sitting down, refusing to work until demands are met. And sometimes those would work, but other times they really failed. And people would just get fired if they were unskilled workers, because what power do they have? They can be replaced by immigrants, usually for cheaper. Um, and they just really didn't have much political power outside of these unions. And this made some people interested in socialism. Socialism for them was the idea that workers, average people, should have the most power in government. And capitalism should be abolished. Our capitalist system guarantees that there's always going to be some who are really rich and some who are really poor. And that's not fair. So when you look at this cartoon, you see this idea, the international workers of the world fighting to rule the world through one big union. If we all work together, we can rise up and take over the means of production. And not all workers believed in socialism, but a huge theme is that labor unions were often accused of being socialists or communists for talking about workers' rights and wanting better conditions. The major labor unions to be familiar with: the Knights of Labor was led by Terence Powderly. The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, Samuel Gompers at this time was their major leader. And the Industrial Workers of the World. This one was the most radical. This one was socialist. They wanted the overthrow of capitalism. They wanted everyone to be in one big union. Eugene Debs, this guy over here, he ran for president as a socialist a few times. Big Bill Haywood was one of their other leaders who used intimidation to try to advocate for the better conditions. The AFL was the most successful, and it was most successful because they had skilled workers. And it's harder to replace skilled workers. So this also had the biggest membership. It still exists today. This is Samuel Gompers over here. During this time period specifically, things did not go well for labor unions. Employers were hostile to them. They didn't want them to organize. They tried to get rid of people, or they could fire people for joining unions or blacklist them, meaning they couldn't get another job. And a lot of these strikes became really violent. In this table over here are some major examples in very short summary of some of the big ones. There's the Great Railroad Strike, 1877. Haymarket Square, there's a riot. The Homestead Strike, where the workers took over a plant owned by Andrew Carnegie, and the Pinkertons came in and were tasked with beating them up. The Pullman Strike also was on Pullman railroad cars. So you can look at these. I don't think you need to know the details, but you need to understand that things got violent between workers and between owners of these businesses. And the government consistently stepped in on the side of the businesses. These workers did not make great gains during this time period because they were consistently opposed, and workers died in some of these conflicts.